Well, one of the misconceptions that a lot of people have is that somehow Prostasia Foundation is an organization that is made up of MAPS or is led by MAPS, and neither of those things are true. Like, that's one of the false statements that people have been putting around about us. Like, we don't have anyone on our team, and never have, who identifies as being minor attracted. We're led by experts, we're led by stakeholders from those stigmatized groups that I mentioned, but we don't actually have any MAP representatives. We do have representatives from the professional communities that work with MAPS, such as researchers and clinicians. But yeah, like, I mean, if people have this fear, for example, one of the anti-Prostasia videos that was going around had the idea that Prostasia has a headquarters opposite an elementary school, which is somehow filled with pedophiles, and nothing could be further from the truth. Like, so a lot of these fears are actually just misplaced, and there's nothing much more I can say about them other than this is an example of where people let their fears sort of run away with themselves and, take them into sort of conspiracy theory waters that just don't really deserve the credit that they receive.
Hey there, folks. Welcome back to another episode here on John Chen Out to the World. Today, I have a very intriguing guest with me, Dr. Jeremy Malcolm, the Executive Director of the Prostasia Foundation. Now, his thesis as a doctorate in law features in the Multi-Stakeholder Governance and the Internet Governance Forum. Now, the Prostasia Foundation has had recent backlash and critiques from various organizations and individuals on YouTube. Now, is that all valid or justified? Today, I want to find that out with the executive director. I really appreciate Jeremy for joining us today, and I would love for you to take the stage and just explain, why did you create this organization, Prostasia Foundation?
Thanks, John. It's great to be talking with you today. So I've been working in advocacy for most of my professional life. I worked as a consumer rights advocate, a human rights advocate, and then a digital rights advocate. And in all of these roles, I found that the easiest way to get people to accept the violation of their rights is to say that it's necessary to protect children, which is ironic because protecting children is one of the most important responsibilities for our society. But it's something that we need to get right, and it's difficult to do that when fear and hate are being weaponized to push a political agenda. So Prostasia Foundation was formed in 2018 when President Trump signed into law a bill called Prostasia, which its proponents claimed would end child sex trafficking. But in reality, all it did was to harm sex workers, to force internet companies to censor a broad range of content about sex, and to make it more difficult to conduct anti-trafficking operations. So Prostasia brought together a bunch of experts who felt that this was the wrong approach and had become sick and tired of, child safety being used as a cloak for measures that were really intended to harm marginalized groups, to censor the internet, or to give more money and power to law enforcement. Instead, we promote an evidence-based approach that prioritizes preventing child sexual abuse before it happens. So that's how and why we were formed in a nutshell.
I see. So your argument is that this law, this policy, Prostasia, was actually enabling the prosecution of children, as I saw in your blog post about why you started the Prostasia Foundation, as well as sex workers. They were not actually being helped by this policy. So there were more people actually being harmed in ways that came off as under the guise of protecting children and their welfare. And in fact, it was actually working against certain marginalized groups.
And this happens again and again because politicians know that all they need to do is to say, think of the children and their law will pass. And so this happens with censorship laws, it happens with criminal justice laws, and they really don't get examined under the magnifying glass to the extent that they should. And so Prostasia's mission is kind of twofold. First of all, to apply that magnifying glass to laws and policies that are said to be for the protection of children. And then secondly, we amplify and promote actual child sexual abuse prevention work that is being done by experts and clinicians, which often gets overlooked by politicians, and which is also often the subject of a lot of stigma, which I think we'll be talking about as we continue in our conversation.
You bet, you bet. So give me some examples of why this specific foster sesta policy was harmful to these individuals, say sex workers and even children who had sexual deviant behaviors or whatever the case was, they were prosecuted. Like, what were some examples of why this happened and you thought it was harmful to sex workers and other people?
Yeah, well, I mean, because it was a really blunt instrument, and really just the thought that went into this was just, well, child sex trafficking is related to sex work, which is facilitated by the internet. Therefore, we can solve this problem by making internet companies responsible for the facilitation of sex trafficking. There was no research beyond that sort of intuition that went into it. And so we were a party, Prostasia Foundation was a party to a constitutional lawsuit that is trying to have foster sesta declared unconstitutional. And one of the things that we pointed out in that lawsuit was that internet companies, to protect their own hides, they were just censoring anything that had to do with sex. And this included some information about child sexual abuse prevention. It also included sex education resources. It also included people who, just provide massage services or things that are really tangentially related to the subject of the bill. Now, what should the approach have been instead of this? Well, like an evidence-based approach to this would have involved, looking at what are the actual risk factors that make children susceptible to trafficking, and what are the protective factors that prevent a child from falling victim to those risks. And if we took that sort of approach, we would find out that some of the risks include, for example, the stigma against LGBTQ children that forces them out of their families and onto the streets, an underfunded and poorly supervised foster care system is another cause, lack of social services that children can access directly. So if we really wanted to address child sex trafficking using an evidence-based approach, we would be addressing those root causes of the problem rather than just addressing the outward signs of where the system has failed, and essentially sweeping the problem under the carpet.
Right. So you're saying that policies like foster sesta is actually allowing that to continue, again, under the guise of trying to just label this policy as helping child human sex trafficking, preventing it. And what is good about it then? Like, obviously they passed it for a reason. Like, what are these policies good for? I mean, how is the balance askew? How is it so much that they're not helping children as much as they intend to?
Well, again, I mean, we're focusing on a law that's been passed several years ago. Since then, there's been evidence that it has actually hindered law enforcement investigations, because previously when so sex trafficking is a lot more rare than the public believes it to be, but it does happen. And one of the best leads that prosecutors had in tracking down real cases of sex trafficking was to look online in forums where sex is advertised. And since those forums have been shut down, those leads have vanished. So that doesn't mean that sex trafficking is no longer happening. It just means that it's no longer happening where we can see it. So it's made it more difficult to prosecute these cases. There is another law, the Safe Sex Workers Study Act, which is being proposed and has been put into Congress but hasn't made much progress yet, which would study the effects of foster sesta and see where it has failed and how a different approach might work better. Ideally, that sort of work should have been done beforehand rather than after. But now we're in the state where this law exists, and all we can do is really look at where it failed and maybe try and take a more evidence-based approach next time.
Right. I think that's a very valid and good approach. Like, look at policies like foster sesta in the past, those who are similar, and then try to quantify what are the good effects, what are the good outcomes against the negative outcomes. And I hope that there has been some good, but as you argue, there has been really bad and nefarious actually outcomes for children, people who are trying to protect children, and those in the sex work industry. Okay, so we know generally that Prostasia Foundation, you're trying to help children, be able to protect them from cases of child sexual abuse and human sex trafficking, but also sex workers as well. And censorship is a big part of that. So what is this organization more broadly trying to help serve? Who are the people that it helps serve?
So that's a good question. And we do, people who come across us for the first time are often confused about that, because we do approach this differently and deliberately so. And the work that we do and the approach that we take is kind of provocative. So I would say that there are two main constituencies that we serve. The most obvious one is, like other child protection organisations, it's there in the name. The ultimate beneficiaries of our work are children, because our primary objective is to eliminate child sexual abuse. But we don't directly represent children because we don't have them as members and they're not part of our management structure. So we directly help or serve those who are engaged in or who choose to ally with our mission of child sexual abuse prevention, but who are ignored by or who feel unsafe or uncomfortable with other groups. And sex workers are just one example of those sort of stigmatized groups who are left out of the field of child protection. Last month, we're recording this in December, so in November, we conducted a community survey which showed that 70% of Prostasia's community identifies as being one or more of LGBTQ, kinky, or a fan or artist. So those are other examples of communities that are affected by stigma and which the public often falsely treats as being part of the problem of child sexual abuse. We help them to identify instead as being part of the solution.
I like that you have a redemptive narrative that you create out of that. People who generally are stigmatized and may be kind of conflated with people who may be offenders or people who are not normalized, or accepted within broader society, don't help perpetuate certain types of conservative values or so forth around sexuality.
Yeah, because whether or not you have conservative values or whether you have liberal values, like, you can still believe in protecting children. And I think because the child protection sector is dominated by conservative groups who are anti-pornography, anti-sex work, and so on, it really excludes a large segment of society which doesn't identify with those values, but which still wants to protect children from abuse, because, that's basically universal.
Right. So that includes LGBTQ folks who are kinksters, people. So BDSM could be associated with kinksters, for those who don't know, people who have more, I would say, vibrant sexual lifestyles, would not harm them or other partners, just have different types of expressions in their sexualities. And then also you have MAPS. So that is, I think, a big part of the controversy. Professors like Alan Walker, who recently was on Prostasia, talking about people who were previously labeled pedophiles, which I think most people understand, people who are attracted to minors, people who are attracted to pubescents and prepubescents, right? So understanding how do they ethically treat MAPS, people who are attracted to minors, alongside Prostasia, people who want to be able to protect the welfare of children, but at the same time are associating with individuals who want to humanize individuals with these attractions. How do you go about trying to delegate, these responsibilities amongst your team? You don't share people's sexualities. You don't make them come out and say, this is my sexuality, I'm LGBTQ, or I'm a MAPS, or whatever the case may be. But it does give you a pause for concern, how the PR may come off, because as we know, certain conservatives like Ruslan on YouTube, or even Blair White, who's a trans woman themselves, they have really doubled down on the critique of this organization because you've associated yourselves with MAPS individuals and professors like Alan Walker, who had to take a leave of absence. So what do you think, under that heavy burden, I think, of critique, is the goal of trying to work with people who are minor attracted?
Well, let's first define some terms. So MAPS are those who are sexually attracted to minors. That's literally what MAPS stands for. Because minor is a term that's defined by law, which means people under 18, being a MAP doesn't necessarily mean being a pedophile, but it does include pedophiles, those who find prepubescent minors sexually attractive.
Okay, so what is the distinction between, say, a person who's attracted to a 3-year-old versus the person who's attracted to a 17-year-old? Because
one of the differences is that psychologically it's quite normal to be attracted to a 17-year-old, even though it may, depending on where you live, it may be unlawful to act on that attraction, just as it would be for a 3-year-old. But if you are attracted to a 3-year-old, that's very unusual. So a recent survey found that about 14% of ordinary adults have experienced some attraction towards young teenagers, which the vast majority have never acted on. Whereas attraction towards prepubescent minors, or pedophilia properly, runs at more like 1 to 2%. So it's much more rare. And MAP is an umbrella category that encompasses both the unusual attraction towards young children, as well as including those with a more common attraction towards teens. And the only thing that really binds these together is that in both cases, it can be illegal to act on that attraction. And the term MAP doesn't imply one way or the other about whether the attraction has been acted on. And that's one reason why experts like Alan Walker said, well, we should use that term instead of pedophile, because pedophile, firstly, really only refers to that very small group of people who are attracted to prepubescents. And also it implies in the general public's mind someone who has offended or inevitably will offend, and that doesn't represent the reality. And so that's why we try and use more accurate language when we're talking about this problem, because if the group of people that we're talking about is really more of a stereotype than a real category of people, it's hard to even conceptualize how to manage their treatment. We have to have an accurate understanding of who we're talking about before we can talk about preventing abuse.
I think that's a great point. Trying to delineate, okay, what are the differences between MAPs and sexual offenders? Because there are sexual offenders who are not MAPs, right?
Exactly. So sex offenders are those who, commit offences either against children or against adults. And sex offenders, even sex offenders who do offend against children, aren't necessarily sexually attracted to them. Like estimates of about 73% of child sexual abuse is committed by those who are primarily attracted to adults. It's hard to imagine why, but being a rapist or an abusive parent doesn't necessarily include being sexually attracted to children. It's a different category. Also, about 35% of child sexual abuse is committed by other children. It's child-on-child abuse. Yeah. So really being a MAP and being a sex offender are two very different categories, which don't overlap nearly as much as people tend to think.
That makes sense. Now, that still doesn't negate the possibility of having really strict laws, because people are typically afraid of sex offenders, MAPs, right? Sex offenders trying to get into spaces where there are children around, vulnerable people around, women. And for Elizabeth Bruenig, who's part of the New York Times, which is a columnist there, she writes a lot on the sex abuses in the Catholic Church. And in her view, she says that convicted sex offenders and minor attracted persons, as you call them in your FAQ and publication, so they're responding to Prostasia. I think maybe they are conflating this idea of sex offenders and minor attracted persons. And what you are adamant about is you're trying to differentiate minor attracted persons, sex offenders. They overlap, and we can argue about how much they overlap too. But her fear, and I think generally for myself and other people, there's a general social fear that people who are minor attracted will offend because of those desires. And she goes on to say, should not be involved with children in any capacity, whether in allyship role, protection role, or any other role. So she doesn't believe in one of the core statements of your group and who makes up that group. How do you feel about that?
Well, one of the misconceptions that a lot of people have is that somehow Prostasia Foundation is an organization that is made up of MAPs or is led by MAPS, and neither of those things are true. Like, that's one of the false statements that people have been putting around about us. Like, we don't have anyone on our team, and never have, who identifies as being minor attracted. We're led by experts, we're led by stakeholders from those stigmatized groups that I mentioned, but we don't actually have any MAP representatives. We do have representatives from the professional communities that work with MAPS, such as researchers and clinicians. But yeah, like, I mean, if people have this fear, for example, one of the anti-Prostasia videos that was going around had the idea that Prostasia has a headquarters opposite an elementary school, which is somehow filled with pedophiles, and nothing could be further from the truth. Like, so a lot of these fears are actually just misplaced, and there's nothing much more I can say about them other than this is an example of where people let their fears sort of run away with themselves and, take them into sort of conspiracy theory waters that just don't really deserve the credit that they receive.
I see. Now, you have 4 different strategies generally that your program at Prostasia is trying to espouse. Strategy 1, we'll talk about what does research or evidence-based child protection laws mean? So what kind of laws have you been looking at, and how are they actually actively trying to help children in their welfare, trying to give them safe environments, as well as helping those in instances like abandonment or human sex trafficking, for that matter?
So an evidence-based approach means taking a public health approach to the problem, viewing child sexual abuse as a public health issue rather than just a criminal justice issue. Because if you look at the problem just as a criminal justice issue, it means you're not paying attention to it until after a child has been harmed, and then you're prosecuting the offender. Whereas a public health approach is more about stopping abuse in the first place. And there are 2 elements to that, which I've already alluded to. One of them is reducing the risk factors that can contribute towards offending. And the other one is increasing the protective factors that can prevent offending from happening. Yeah. And so examples of policies that follow that approach include comprehensive sex education, stigma-free mental health services, and social supports. And so some of the laws that we do support include, there's one called the Invest in Child Safety Act, which would provide $5 billion of new funding for child sexual abuse prevention and the enforcement of existing laws. So not just prevention, but enforcement as well. Okay. And it would also kick off a study into, what are the risk factors and what are the prevention interventions that have been developed to address this problem, and how well are they working? So that's an example of what we would say is an evidence-based law. Unfortunately, it doesn't have much support at all in Congress because, as I sort of alluded to, politicians are more interested in addressing, public fears which may not be factually based, rather than addressing underlying problems. And so, I think the first step in getting politicians to take the right approach is to work on increasing public awareness about the real drivers of this problem and the real solutions. And I think that's one of the reasons why we platformed Alan Walker as one of the experts who's working in this field and who has the support of all of their peers. There were more than 60 other professors and other experts who signed a letter in support of Dr. Walker for making statements that are controversial but true. Pedophilia and child sexual abuse are not the same thing. Nobody chooses what they find sexually attractive. Attraction is not the same as action. And even if you are unfortunate enough to be in that small category of people who has pedophilia, it's not a guarantee that you're going to abuse a child. There are always ways of preventing offending. And once those messages get out there, I think it will become easier in the future for policymakers to sort of follow that lead. And it's just a really difficult and fraught process to get those messages out there, because even by stating those messages, there is, as you mentioned, an immediate blowback and attack from those who believe incorrectly that this is somehow trying to destigmatize or normalize sexual abuse, which is not what it's about at all. It's about the stigma that exists is really just a misunderstanding of the truth. And if we can correct people's misunderstandings about how child sexual abuse happens and how it relates to pedophilia and how it doesn't relate to pedophilia, that can only make the work of prevention easier in the long term. And I just wish it wasn't such a fraught process and didn't involve so much, abuse being thrown around. But we'll never get the laws that we want if our starting point is misunderstanding and fear.
Right. I think that's well said. Now, even coming into this conversation for myself, I had my hesitations. I don't know what I'm going to find out. I don't know if Jeremy is going to be advocating for looser restrictions on what adults can do, and, their sexual lifestyles. How does that correlate in policy? How does that get played out in the public sphere? Is he actually allowing these individuals to be proud of this attraction, And I don't think anyone has ever said that. Alan Walker has not said that. But I believe, what really has stirred up the pot, so to speak, for those on the left, those on the right, is the fact that they did insist that, attractions are not morally or morally wrong in themselves. And I think when you look at it, it's like, yeah, you get that. It's because you can't control what you are attracted to. You have no choice in that. But I think the morality piece that comes alongside of that is, well, if I'm holding a knife, cutting onions and everything, there's a danger with that knife. That potential is there, right? Mm-hmm. So stay away, kiddo. Don't come near me when I'm chopping up an onion. And if you have someone who professes to a friend that they have rape fantasies, and that friend is, say, a woman who's not very powerful, of course, there are instinctual bodily reactions that we have. Okay, here is some danger. There's some potential danger. And I think that's part of the process alongside of the social stigma. I think it just goes in and weaves into this more social fabric of stigma that we have, because it's a protective layer that we have against all these individual cases, which some maps individuals who are ethical minor attracted persons, right, is the right term. They won't harm a child. But generally, for those who are psychopaths, for those who are sexual perpetrators, they could be straight, they could be attracted to just about any adult, hardly children. They are the ones that we're most concerned about. And so there's that social stigma, I think, that is very pervasive, which keeps us from having these types of dialogues. Now, I have guests on, say, Katie Faust, who has given some evidence and a lot of stories about children who have certain deficits in homes of surrogacy, born out of IVF and gay parents and so forth. And, she's very loving to her gay friends and trans friends, but there's a lot of heat sometimes that comes from the LGBT community. Just in the same way that you have gotten heat from those on the conservative right and those in the LGBTQ community even. And even my friend Joe Court, who came on, he's a doctor and a sexologist. He has therapy sessions with straight males who talk about, their seemingly gay behaviors, right? Having sex with other men, ejaculating, having masturbation, with other men. All these things are very controversial because we have our social filters already preset for us to think in a certain way about what's the social mores, what defines gay, straight, and otherwise, and what is supposed to be a healthy family, right, for Katie Faust and her organization than before us, what actually puts the child first. And I really do value what you are putting forth for us, is that you do, and I believe that, I can attest that, I believe that you do have good intentions for children. Now, I'm not saying that you won't get heat for it. You will continue to get heat for this because you associate with MAPS and people who are trying to normalize people who have pedophilic desires, right? Now, what is your views and goals in terms of the people, say, that you're working for as well, besides the children, right? Because there's stigma against them as well. Sex workers, for example, kinksters, how do they fit into the equation of trying to protect children's rights? How do they help?
Well, partly it's about, because we're both a child protection organization and a human rights organization, when the human rights of others are infringed on the basis of, on the pretext of child protection, then our role is to defend them. But the other thing is that they also have a lot of expertise in their own communities, that is important in protecting children from abuse within those communities. So let me give you, or protecting adults within those communities as well. So let me give you a concrete example of that. So the American Law Institute this year, it's an institution of lawyers. They released a new version of their model penal code on sexual offences, which is designed to update the law on topics like consent, sex trafficking, and the sex offence registry. And they actually did listen to stigmatised groups because they wanted to make the law better. And so one of the groups they spoke to was the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom, or NCSF, which represents the consensual kink and BDSM community. And Prostasia Foundation is an affiliate member of the NCSF. They've been doing magnificent work on defining and educating people around consent for years. And so by including them and drawing on this work, the American Law Institute was able to make recommendations for reforms to the law on consent that work for a community that lives and breathes consent culture in everything it does. The same applies to sex workers. If you want to stop minors from entering sex work, the police aren't going to be the solution. Nobody in the sex industry will ever go to the police for help if they can avoid it, because this ends up in them being arrested at best, and at worst, they may even be sexually assaulted by the police. So instead, if you want to help minors who are performing sex work, which is obviously a bad idea, the first people that they're likely to turn to for help are going to be other sex workers, because people in the sex industry don't want to see minors doing this work and being abused and having their content put up online. Of course they don't. And for years, in fact, sex workers have been campaigning for stronger consent and safety standards for their industry. But do policymakers turn to them for advice in combating abuse in their industry? No, they turn to morals campaigners and credit card companies. So one of the reasons why we platform these groups is because they actually have, some lived experience that is useful in protecting against abuse in their sector. And if we're not listening to them, then we're missing out on that experience and that wisdom.
Right. So that is your second strategy. You are trying to bring about the voices within these more marginalized and very vulnerable groups of people, say sex workers, LGBTQ folks, kinksters, who have a lot of stigma on them. And they can offer us, as you say, a lot of wisdom about how to be able to create better protective laws for children.
Yeah, if we only listen to law enforcement, we only get carceral solutions. But carceral solutions are ineffective at dealing with the complexity of this problem. If we want to make progress, we have to also bring in non-carceral approaches such as education, mental health support, and social services. And that means listening to people from outside of law enforcement and also those who are harmed by the criminal justice system. And so while we acknowledge that there is a role, an important role for the criminal justice system in dealing with this problem, it's only a small part of the total picture.
Sure. Now, one could say, well, most people probably don't want to become sex workers, and to be able to put this type of work out there, because you do have a podcast, right, in line with Prostasia, that is allowing advocates for your work, sex workers included, to host talks about how do I prepare myself for sex work? How do I take care of myself? And some of the statements, are pretty provocative, saying like, I make sure that I get really, really high, the night before and so forth. Like certain things I think is a little bit more facetious, but
yeah.
When you have those types of conversations, I think people will take and cherry pick those statements and make it seem blown up, where, like weed is legal nowadays, so that's not a problem. But what is the general appeal, to like more family-oriented individuals when they come across organizations like Prostasia? Obviously, there is a deterrence, perhaps, because you're talking about sexual topics, mature sex work topics, and I think that is a breach that needs to be gapped. How do you be able to convey to individuals, we care about your children, we really, really do care, and having these people come alongside of us, they can offer that wisdom, but it does have a difficulty in terms of PR, I think.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I mean, the interview that you're referring to, that you're alluding to, is not our best example of trying to sell our approach. That there was an icebreaker question at the start that my colleague made to the person we were interviewing, and that's the road they went down, and we kept that in the interview because that's just how the conversation went. Same as our conversation. Sometimes it'll go in a direction that we don't expect. So we have, about 30 episodes of our podcast series, and yes, you're right. I mean, people will definitely cherry pick the most controversial or the most, odd seeming examples. Same with our Twitter account. We had a very controversial tweet that we did a few years ago, and that's the one that everyone comes back to. They're never going to.
Taiwan? Is it?
Sorry?
Is it the cartoon?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what we were trying to get across with that tweet was that we need to focus on if there is real child sexual abuse material out there, we should be reporting that rather than reporting cartoons. If there's a cartoon that you don't like, just block it, and then you'll never see it again. So let's focus on that. Let's focus on real child abuse reporting rather than cartoons. But do we always get our messaging right in PR terms? No. Like, we're mostly a volunteer team. And we're learning as we go along, because nobody has had an organization like this before. So the community that we're building is definitely unique. And we don't always agree with each other on the way that we approach this. But we are growing stronger and more effective. This year, we have a record budget that we've been putting towards prevention research. And we've had more members of our team joining than ever before. So even though our progress may seem to be challenging at times, we're learning and improving as we go. And I think that in the future, Prostasia Foundation is going to be a little better at navigating how we deliver our message in a way that doesn't result in members of our team being attacked and having to, in some cases, fear for their safety.
Right. Now, that's a point that you also brought up as the third strategy about censorship that you kind of alluded to with the hentai, the cartoon pornography, right? And so there's some distinction issues between like what's considered porn, a cartoon, and what is harmful, what's not harmful. What do you think, as someone who has studied law, especially in this area, this is your expertise, right?
Yeah.
Where does censorship go wrong? And why is Prostasia getting hurt by this? Because obviously, like, there is a general fear that there's going to be child pornography out there. How are you pro censorship in certain ways, and how are you not?
Yeah, well, we are against child sexual abuse and the dissemination of images of child sexual abuse, of real children being abused, either in photos or videos. That is a form of abuse. It's image-based abuse. And so really, that's where we believe censorship resources should be focused, because there's no valid place for that content online. Just like there's no valid place for abusive imagery involving adults, revenge porn and so on is also not welcome anywhere online, and rightly so. However, censorship with a broad brush can affect those who are innocent. It can affect LGBTQ communities, sex educators, basically anyone who talks about sex online. You may have noticed yourself that if you talk about sex on YouTube or on TikTok, your content's likely to be demonetized or removed, or you'll have to self-censor. There's a lot of people who, use this strange new vocabulary when they're trying to talk about sex online just to avoid censorship. How is that healthy? The other point is that our criminal justice system wastes a lot of money by trying to censor content that doesn't cause harm to anyone. This year, a publisher of sexual stories was sentenced to 40 years in prison because some of the stories and illustrations on his website involved fictional minors. And this is in a context where we have a backlog of real child sexual abuse cases that aren't being prosecuted because we don't have enough money and we don't have enough resources, and we're going to imprison someone for publishing stories. It's really just a misallocation of resources. And that's one of the reasons why we oppose censorship. Censorship doesn't deal with the problem. It sweeps it under the carpet. And it does divert our attention away from real cases of abuse, which is what we should be concentrating on. So that's not to say that, triggering content should be freely accessible to everyone online, especially, pornography shouldn't be accessible to children online. We've never said that. But what we promote is tagging content, warning users for content, and basically making sure that nobody is exposed to sexual content without their consent. So really providing more information rather than censoring is the way to go. Making sure that if there's a story out there that involves a minor in a sexual situation, it definitely shouldn't be something you come across accidentally. You should be warned about it, and you should have the chance to keep it off your to keep it out of view.
Right. Okay. So I could definitely see that you're not like a Xi Jinping Maoist type of Big Brother approach, to censorship. You shouldn't say just like censor it all. Anything with the slightest hint of what comes off as sexual behavior in children should be deemed as unworthy of the internet. But then you also want to be a little bit more specific about, well, what happened if I have questions, about sex? What happened if I have questions about what someone did to me? Was that inappropriate, right? And if you don't have those resources, that could be a potential argument for having certain types of more incremental or specific regulations toward divvying up what is accessible, what's appropriate to have online, and to have those warnings. So I read that on your website. One of your articles was talking about that, having those warnings when you look at Google, because I imagine, what would I get if I searched child pornography? I'm not interested or would not want anyone, myself, to look up something like that. But what do we ask of ourselves? What happened if there was a FBI case, and would the FBI actually get in contact with us if they saw us looking at this article, right, about child abuse or whatever it is? So I think drawing that line can be sometimes hard on the internet, but I think generally, again, goes back to this general stigma about abusing children. And we're going to have a heck of a time. You're going to have a heck of a time trying to convey to people about how we should try to balance that in a way that's going to be very cohesive to general understandings and education about sex education, abuse as well, but without getting into the nasty type of exploitive stuff that may creep in, right? Now, you have a sex positive view on your platform, the Prostasia platform. You say that while preventing child sexual abuse, you want to have a sex positive view around these themes. So how does that look for people, not just kinksters and people who are into the sex industry, but for MAPS individuals, right? This has been a huge point of contention because Prostasia does advocate for the use of childlike sex dolls and cartoon pornography, right? Childlike cartoon pornography. So why do you believe this is helpful? And is there any evidence, would you say, that this is actually going to prevent people from perpetrating sexual offenses?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's accurate to say that we advocate for the use of these outlets such as dolls and cartoons. Okay. What we do advocate for is research into what the effects of the availability of these outlets is. And we advocate against, as I said, against the misallocation of law enforcement resources towards prosecuting people for possessing these outlets, at least until the research has been done. Because despite assumptions that people have, there is no research about what the effects of these outlets is on real life sexual offending. And this is the major research project that we're sponsoring at the moment. We have university researchers from the State University of New York and from Nottingham Trent University in the UK that we've raised money to get them to independently find out, do these cartoons and dolls make people more likely to offend or less likely to offend, or do they make no difference? And we really need to have that data before we can decide whether there's any value in banning them or not. Right. So that's as to the the point that you raised on sex dolls and cartoons. But more generally, why do we promote sex positivity in association with child protection? And that is much misunderstood. People think, sex positivity must mean it's okay to have sex with minors. No, that's not what it means at all. In fact, it kind of means the opposite of that. A sex positive approach means that every human being has the right to express and enjoy their own sexuality, provided that they do so consensually. And in fact, sex positivity underpins our opposition to child sexual abuse because it is a consent violation by definition. Children cannot consent to sex with adults. So it's not in conflict. Sex positivity is not in conflict with child protection. It underpins child protection. And a sex positive approach is what policies like comprehensive sex ed and consent culture are all about. Our prevailing belief as a society is that, by addressing to address problems of sexual violence, we have to focus on the thoughts and the attractions themselves as being bad. And a sex positive approach is that, thoughts and attractions are neutral and that it's actions that matter. And so really our approach is just about, let's focus less about what goes on inside people's heads, which we can't control anyway. Let's focus more on, are these thoughts and feelings being expressed in a consensual way?
Sure. Yes, I think for myself, there's arguments for both. Like, obviously, behaviors are always preceded by thoughts and desires, right? I think one can philosophically argue, like, how does one come up with murdering someone, raping someone, abusing a child, right? Because they planned it out. Or, no one just doesn't choose to do those things. And I think there, again, with your argument about what is moral and immoral, like Alan Walker, what got them in trouble probably is talking about the morality of those desires. And I think personally for me, I lean a little bit more conservative on this issue where there is a objectifying issue, right? Are we objectifying people through pornography? Are we objectifying children through these different resources, right? For MAPS, individuals who can't contain their desires. And one thing that I want to bring up, other than this piece, I want to mention this study, right? I don't think there are a lot of studies, like you said. I don't think there's a lot of robust studies about what are the preventative measures, what are the things that people should be doing, lifestyle changes, such as using sex toys. I personally don't advocate for that, but for people who have the research, maybe one day, could that actually be beneficial? And there's a study done at the University of Birmingham showing 57 convicted child molesters, and 64.9% of participants said they had masturbated to deviant sexual fantasies before committing their first hands-on act of child sexual abuse. And, this is going to be an issue because we don't have more follow-up studies and it's self-reported, right? These are sex offenders. How about those who are not sex offenders? What did they report, right? We have limitations on this. I totally agree that we should have more research on the behaviors, the thoughts even, of people who have offended and people who have not offended. MAPS, for example, right? That's, again, a subcategory of people who should not even be classified as sex offenders, but that potential, I think, is the underlying reason for that stigma, for that fear of talking about MAPS and people who are attracted to minors. So if we go about viewing the world as black and white, as we currently do sometimes with MAPS and sex offenders, they're maybe the same thing. Say that's the way that we view the world right now. Is that so bad, right? Because if we have strict regulations, at least against, the age of consent and so forth, people that you work with, I believe it's Guy Hamilton Smith, right? They actually have offense in the past. They were a sexual offender in the past when they were 22, and they were very apologetic. I sympathize to a degree with them. They made poor decisions and they used child pornography. Now, I think that's going to discredit him a lot when he comes into this organization and works alongside of you guys. Does it give him some insight? One can argue that, but at the same time, when you are someone who has perpetrated that causes a lot of alarms to go off. And criminologist Eric Hickey states that serial killers and their victims, that's the book. The millions of people read pornography without harming anyone. It could be a facilitator for one person while having no effects on others. So porn is not the main culprit, right? Just because someone watches porn doesn't make them a serial killer or a rapist. Still, the fact that certain serial murderers have insisted that pornography was a major factor in their killing young women and children cannot be ignored. So this is something taken out of the Psychology Today by Dr. Catherine Ramsland, who's a forensic psychologist and author. I think this general theme and general thought process is because we give people, like maybe sex offenders, even the outlet of pornography, they're more likely to actually fan the flame of having that potential of committing that crime. So that's where strategy for I don't know if it can work fully. If it goes in the direction of we find research that actually says this is going to help society because they're not going to offend as much, it still has to answer the philosophical issue of, does it objectify children? And so those are two major barriers. What do you think?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a lot that you just dumped on me there. Let me go through those point by point if I can remember them all. So, yes, firstly, Guy Hamilton Smith has not had any association with Prostasia since 2019. We knew that bringing him onto our board onto our advisory council, which is a non-voting body that gives advice to our team, we knew that would be controversial. It was definitely provocative, but he was an expert and still is an expert in rehabilitation through the criminal justice system. He said that going through that saved his life, he believes, and so we thought there was value in getting the perspective of a sex offence law and policy expert who had personal lived experience of how the system helps rehabilitation of offenders and where it fails. So that's one thing. The second point that you made there is the
likelihood of committing an offence because
So I mean, there's a difference, as we know, between correlation and causation. When we do studies that just look at sex offenders, people who have offended, and then look at their pornography use, that doesn't really tell us anything about people who haven't offended, and it doesn't tell us anything about causation. What we're expecting to come out of the research that we're funding is to find that for some people, use of sexual outlets is helpful. For some people, it is harmful. And for some people, it's neither. So what we need to decide is, well, what should we do about the people for whom it is harmful? And even ordinary, 18 plus pornography can be harmful to some people who have, compulsive behaviors and who having this material just sends them into an unhealthy spiral. So what we're planning what we're hoping will come out of our research is some guidelines for clinicians to help those clients and to advise them what sort of stuff they should actually stay away from. So we're not saying that this material is likely to be helpful to everyone across the board. There will be some for whom it's helpful, some for whom it's harmful. What we need to decide as a society is, on balance, would we be better off banning this entire category of content, which would impact not only offenders and MAPs, but also a lot of innocent people, a lot of young people creating fan art and fan fiction, which for them is completely age appropriate. It's completely, innocent. They're just wanting to talk about, Steven Universe in, sort of romantic context or whatever. This is the kind of content that people are suggesting needs to be regulated and banned. So that would impact a lot of innocent people. And we need, as a society, with the benefit of research in hand, we need to decide, is the harm from this content so severe and so widespread that we need to ban it? Or is it possible to address the harms of this content in a more limited way, such as through, as I mentioned, having content warnings and so on? And really all that we're saying is, let's get that research done so that we can make that decision. Another point that you made is about the question of morality, even if you have an attraction that is unchosen. Mm-hmm. can it still be judged morally? Now, that's actually a question that Prostasia Foundation, and this may be a surprising answer to you, but Prostasia has always actually been agnostic about that. We've actually said you can still privately view someone as being immoral for having this sort of attraction, even if it was unchosen. We're not saying that you can't have your private moral views, and those views may be influenced by your religion. They may be influenced by your upbringing. Nobody's going to say you can't pass a moral judgment on someone who has this attraction. Personally, I don't think it's worth judging someone morally for something they didn't choose, but I'm not going to force you if you have a different opinion. I'm not going to force you to change your mind.
I can agree to a certain level. I do.
And so all that we are saying is that your private moral judgment against these people shouldn't become violent, shouldn't be abusive towards people who are just in many cases trying to live their lives and seek help. And that's what Alan Walker was subjected to. They were a professional trying to do their job, and for expressing the views that they did, they were subjected to death threats, to smears of allegations against themselves. And I have to say, I've been subjected to the same. I've been receiving nasty phone calls at all hours of the night. I've been receiving insinuations about myself and my family. My personal details have been doxed. And so when we're fighting against stigma, against the discussion of this topic, we're really just saying, okay, have whatever judgments you want in the privacy of your own mind, but don't turn those into abuse against people who have actually done nothing wrong.
Right. And I believe you when you say that, because you are promoting research, right? So if there is evidence-based practices and policies that will help children, Prostasia is trying to advocate for that. And so for those viewers who are watching in, and, again, it can be a huge turnoff right from the get-go when we mention MAPS, minor attracted persons, and then trying to disentangle that from sex offenders. Many people just don't think about it on a daily basis. So they just go with the social morals and the morals. It just gives them something to feed off of really instinctively. And when we talk about it, there's a lot of nitty gritty. There's a lot of fine details within the gray zones, right? Of what's consensual, what should be censored, what shouldn't be censored, and the autonomy of the individual. We can talk about age of consent and all that. But I really did learn a lot from you, Jeremy. I hope you don't come off of this and feel like, wow, that was like really heavy. And really, I offer all these critiques or offer all these questions because I believe there are some good points, some really good points that you bring up about in the Prostasia Foundation. Obviously, there is still a lot of reticence around like what kind of behaviors sexually or otherwise people should do. And for everyone out there listening and watching, you should think about what you do with your body and what you do with others consensually and otherwise. And so what do you hope then, out of this conversation? What do you hope that viewers would get out of this conversation? What would they learn?
Yeah, well, I do appreciate the way that you've been framing your questions, and I have been very happy to try and engage with you honestly and openly. So hopefully some of your viewers, if they have already heard of Prostasia Foundation, may come away with some of their misapprehensions about our motives being corrected. I hope they'll realise that, the causes of child sexual abuse and the solutions to it perhaps aren't as simple as they may have believed. And the whole notion that there are simple black and white causes and solutions is a false narrative that actually fuels a lot of problems in our society. And so really, I hope that Prostasia's mission, controversial as it is really just to apply a bit of a corrective to that and to get people to realize, what, maybe things aren't as simple as I believed. Great.
And what resources do you have on Prostasia's side? What kind of other outlets or articles do you write?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, we do have a podcast series, although actually, for the safety of our guests, we are winding that down for a while. But there are 30-odd old episodes to view. We also have a blog with dozens of articles. We have a Get Help page with resources for people who are looking for help either for themselves or for someone else. We have a free monthly newsletter. And for those who'd like to support our work, you can also become a member on our website. And all of those resources are available at prostasia.org.
I'll link some of those down below. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for coming on. And I will share even the social medias that you have. So if people really want to tune into what you're having to share, again, I know for my viewers that this is very, very controversial. And some of the parts of what you do, maybe a majority of what you do, is going to elicit some side-eye reactions. And even here on Out It, this channel is trying to espouse open-ended conversations around sexuality, around gender, around faith and policy, family development. All those things matter to our society. I believe that what you have to offer here today hopefully will clarify about some of the misgrievances of what happened between Alan Walker, and then also what is the true foundation within Prostasia Foundation, the values and the types of activities and policies that you're trying to promote. So thank you again, Jeremy, for coming on.
Thanks very much, John. It's been great to talk to you.